Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. So today, I'm going to do a little bit of an analysis on a podcast that I watched. So Eric Bischoff did an interview with a psychologist on the psychology of wrestling fans. And I watched most of it. It was I think a 2 hour, no, it wasn't 2 hours, probably like a hour and a half conversation. I watched about an hour of it. And just to get an idea of what she would say, and so I could have some responses. And I think it was a pretty good conversation. Now, the doctor was Dr. Carrie Ann Reinhardt, who was a wrestling fan herself. She was not originally a wrestling fan. She was one of those snooty middle-class people who looked down on wrestling until she met her husband, who was a wrestling fan, and he was also an academic. And he sort of pulled her into it. And as a psychologist, she wanted to understand wrestling fans, so she began to go to the shows, and she ended up becoming a fan herself. And if you read the comment section of the videos, you'll know that she's pretty politically motivated. She's a very progressive, rolling of the eyes wrestling fan. So that set it up for me to not really be all that interested in anything that she said, but I was fair. And I actually listened to what she said, and there was some very interesting things that came out of it. So I decided to bring those things to you. So now that the setup is there, let's get into some of the things that she said. So she said that when asked straight up, why do people watch wrestling? She says that usually they have a emotional connection to the characters or the storylines that are in the show, which is a pretty good argument. But she says there's really 3 main points. There's one, the athleticism can be attractive to people because wrestlers typically have the ability to do things that the average person cannot. The second is the fantasy element, which is a sense of connection to a storyline or a character, or I put in brackets representation. And 3 is the drama. Now, she says that when it comes to wrestling not being real, that it's like every other form of entertainment, in so much as long as you can find something in it that you like, you're willing to go along with all 3. You're willing to go along with it. But it has to be one of the things that are in all 3 categories. So some people are emotionally connected to wrestling through being in awe of the athleticism. This would be people who are like fans of like Lucha Libre and stuff like that. I find myself in there a little bit too. And you can see that a lot of the AEW fans are in that high levels of athleticism kind of mold. You know, they're inspired by the Young Bucks, or like guys who are inspired by Shawn Michaels or the Rock and Roll Express, who are the high flyers of their time, you know, Rey Mysterio and stuff like that. Like, wow, these guys can do tremendous things. They're physical marvels. That's one thing. The second is, you know, the representation, the people who see themselves in a character. This is a lot of the people who were, and a lot of this is before our time, but people who are big fans of like the Crusher, who is a big star in the AWA. He was just like a big barreled, beer drinking, bar fighting guy. That was basically his character. It would be the precursor for Stone Cold Steve Austin, who a lot of people saw themselves in that character. The same thing for like a Hulk Hogan or a John Cena, where they would be like superheroes, and you would want to be like that. If you were a wrestler, you would want to be like a Hulk Hogan or an Ultimate Warrior or something like that, and you could be in awe of that. And the third is the drama, the storyline. How is the hero going to get out of this situation? How is he going to overcome this scenario? And that's part of why people watch wrestling. And I can absolutely agree with that. And I don't see anything wrong with that particular part of it. And I find it to be very intriguing. Now, the next point that she mentioned was that fandom in general has high emotional investment that leads to obsession. And people not really having a separation between reality and their fandom. And this becomes a bigger deal a little bit later, as she's talking about co-construction. That wrestling is likely a co-construction of the audience and the performers, in so much that the audience has a lot of control over what the performers do. A good example would be, get the table, or we want tables, and then the wrestler would go and get a table, or, you know, the fans interacting with wrestlers in the audience, you know, yelling at them, and the wrestler yelling back, the wrestler talking to the audience, etc., which is something you don't get in other forms of media. You don't get it in football or basketball too much. You get it a little bit in sports, but not a lot. You don't get it in television or theater at all. And that's really one of the things that really makes people fans of wrestling, is that they feel that they can be heard by the wrestler. They can yell at something at the wrestler, and the wrestler will yell something back, even as a spur of the moment thing. But she even sort of recognized that wrestling, it becomes more difficult to connect when you have larger crowds. And then, of course, she was talking about WWE and AEW, where at an independent show, you're playing to the front row of about, 200 people. And at a Raw or a SmackDown, if there's 8,000 people there, you have to play to the people in the back as well. You have to try to find a way to interact with the entire audience. And it's a little bit more difficult. And it's also actually off-putting to the fans to be in a larger venue. And she said this is one of the reasons why some people may prefer independent wrestling or AEW to WWE, because it's easier for you to be heard. And it's also easier for you to feel like you're in control of what the performers are doing if you are in a smaller venue. And this was a very interesting one, because I hadn't really thought about that. Because as she explained it, it's saying like, hey, are people going along with what you're doing on this wrestling show? And the only way for you to know is through the audience interaction. But what happens when the audience is so large, and then you get sections of the audience that are small representations of the audience who are booing or bored, while a larger section of the audience is cheering or they're engaged. And it's hard for you to express your discontent with something when you are part of a larger group. And she gave herself an example of her being able to yell at a wrestler at an indie show and he can hear it and respond, versus when she went to an AEW show and she would yell from like the bleachers or something like that, and there's no way in the world that the wrestler can hear her. And when you think about that, I think that actually shows why like territory wrestling was so strong, because these were wrestlers who were in a lot of smaller studios. And the studios weren't, super big. You could yell at a wrestler. You could touch them. Like if you go watch a lot of like World Class or like Mid-South, there wasn't even a barricade between you and the wrestler. You just stayed away from the ring. Usually there was like a string that went around the arena, and you just didn't cross that string. But the wrestler would come into the crowd, like the Von Erichs, so you would see people grabbing them and kissing them, and not just smacking hands and all this kind of stuff, but it was a very close connection between the audience and the wrestler, because the wrestler was a local guy and this was a small arena. He could hear you, you could hear him, he could blow kisses at you and all this kind of stuff. And it does make people more engaged. But when the wrestler is no longer a local guy and it's one of those passing through circus kind of things, you do lose that connection. That's like when you go to WWE and you're sitting up in the mezzanine or up in the bleachers, you can cheer and all this kind of stuff, but the likelihood that people can hear you in the ring is very minimal. And therefore you feel disengaged. And in some ways the wrestler can disengage from the audience too, because there's these barricades that separates the wrestler from the audience. There's also a lot of space that separates the wrestler from the audience. And then the wrestler doesn't live in the area. So the chances of you actually coming into contact with them, being able to talk to them, it never really happens. Only if you like run up on them at the airport, which of course is dumb. But all of this is very important because it actually gets people to, how are you going along with the phoniness of the wrestling show? Such as how some people can complain about Lucha Libre when some people do it, but not complain about Lucha Libre when other people do it. Now, this is one of the things I had to think about myself, because I grew up a huge fan of Rey Mysterio, but I don't like the Young Bucks. And you would say, like, what's the difference between, like, if you watch Rey Mysterio or Juventud Guerrera or all of these guys who they do tons of flips and and all that stuff, but you don't like the Young Bucks. I would say, well, the difference is a good 25 years of, when I was a kid versus being an adult now. But it's also, I think I was more impressed by the things that Ray did than I was by the things that the Young Bucks do. I was also more impressed by the presentation of what Rey Mysterio was doing versus the presentation of what the Young Bucks are doing. Basically, because Rey Mysterio was able to sell, he was actually did his stuff in a slower manner. It didn't come across as he was just doing spot, like he was connecting dots, but that he was actually in a struggle. And this move was something that he could actually do to an opponent, because usually he was wrestling people that was slightly taller than he was, and it was around the same size. So it was more believable, as opposed to the Young Bucks, who are sometimes wrestling guys who are much bigger, and then they're no-selling these guys offense, and they're coming across as being the toughest guys in the world. It's a disconnect between these skinny dudes here and this skinny dude here, who this skinny guy, he plays the part of David in the David versus Goliath story better than these guys played a part of David in their David and Goliath stories. So that's something that I had to think about myself, because you do say, all right, I like bigger, larger than life characters, but that doesn't mean I like everybody who's bigger and larger than life. And why would that be? And then you have to get into the qualities of those performers and how those performers were better than others. For instance, why was it okay for Mick Foley to do a lot of the barbed wire, fire, garbage, the stuff that I really don't like, but I kind of roll my eyes when Jon Moxley does it, or I roll my eyes when Abyss is doing it. And then you have to get into the why I am emotionally connected to Mick Foley. He's a much better, he's a much more charismatic performer, in so much as he cut better promos. He was a better actor. You felt more sympathy when things were happening to Mick, especially if you really got to know him and you really grew up with his persona, the Mick Foley or the Mankind persona, or even the Cactus Jack, tough as nails persona. He looked the part, and then he could, switch on you a little bit. And Mick Foley is a very interesting choice, because Mick Foley is one of the guys who got her into wrestling, because she said she met him and they had similar politics and all this kind of stuff, which I really rather not go down the road on that. But that was very interesting to me. It forces you to really think about why two people can have a similar thing and you choose one over the other. And it's really because you're willing to go along with it, because there's something in the guy that you like that makes you connect with that guy. While somebody else who does something similar, there is no connection, because you don't quite have that, and maybe it might be age, because I like Eddie Kingston too, but I still didn't like Eddie Kingston the way I like Mick Foley. I like Jon Moxley too, but not in the same way that I like Mick Foley. So there's going to be limits to Mick Foley falls on thumbtacks or falls off a cage. I'm feeling like, damn, that was crazy. Moxley does it, Eddie Kingston does it, or somebody like that, and I'm just kind of like, okay, they're doing a spot. There's very different elements to it, and a lot of it is in the structure and the construction of the match. And they go into matches being built by the wrestler with the help of the audience, listen to the audience and about the ebbs and the flows of the match. And Bischoff talked about, hey, these guys are scripting matches now that, completely ignore the audience. It doesn't matter what the audience wants. You could change that audience with any audience, because the guys are going to do the match that they have sat around all day and thought about, and they're not really going to tailor the match to the audience. And that's a very much of an AEW thing. And that was very interesting too, because that also explains the disconnect between the audience and fans, the audience and wrestlers too. It's hard to get into a match with a wrestler who is not listening, because he's going to do what he wants to do, regardless of whether you're ready for it or not, regardless of whether you are invested in the story of the match or not, regardless of if you're, paying attention or not. That's a good Young Bucks thing right there, where sometimes they come back too early. Sometimes they'll come back too late. They're not in the moment. They're doing this because this is A, B, C, D, E, F, G. This is how we put it together backstage. You know, you punch, and then I'll roll outside the ring, and then you'll jump off the top rope. Then I'll catch you. You'll celebrate a little bit. I'll get right back up, and then yada, yada, yada. But there's no stop. Let it sink in. Let me sell what actually happened. You get what I'm saying? Like, it's a co-construction there where the audience have to be educated on what's going on. And if you're educating the audience by selling that this actually hurt, what this person just did to me, it can set up the story later. Oh, my knee, oh, my ankles, or my back, or whatever, you know? But when you're blowing through spots and it looks good, it's athletically great, but it lacks drama and it lacks, you know, realism, then people can be taken out of it. And I think that's a really good explanation too of why some people have decided that they're not going to either be fans of certain wrestlers or fans of wrestling in general. And that's something that I really want to consider too. So the last thing I want to discuss from this conversation is she was asked why is she an AEW fan more than WWE? And her first answer was basically political mumbo jumbo, the Vince McMahon stuff, all this kind of stuff. But she said that she appreciates the AEW product because it's born out of fandom, and fandom equals love and, you know, borderline obsession. And Tony Khan is a great example of this because Tony Khan started a wrestling company because of his love of wrestling. He's an unabashed, almost cringe-like wrestling fan, and people are connected to him. And she gave a really good example of when he hugged Claudio Castagnoli, and Claudio was unsettled by it, but Tony Khan wasn't. For him, it was, I love this guy. I've been a fan of his forever. And you could see yourself, if you're an AEW fan, in Tony Khan, being that this is one of my favorite guys in the world. Now he works for me. You know, we're friends. We're blah, 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 blah. And there's a very close connection there. And she said, like, the AEW fans are not afraid to be fans. Where a lot of WWE fans, a lot of them, and her and Bischoff converse about this, is a lot more casuals because a lot of them are more in the closet. And she did this, of course, connects to when she was talking about stereotypes of wrestling fans. And Bischoff talked about this too, is that the stereotype of wrestling fans is that a lot of them are generally low IQ, lower income, et cetera, because every time they do market research, the only people who are willing to admit that they're wrestling fans are people who are lower income. And Bischoff says that, you know, he would at some point in time be nervous to tell people that he worked for Turner and that he worked on the wrestling side. But when he eventually did tell them that, these people would go into the, you know, it's fake, blah, 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 blah. And then they would say, man, can you believe that Hulk Hogan did blah, 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 blah? And he would say, well, you are an undercover fan. And you realize that quite a bit when it comes to like wrestling. Like the more you watch wrestling, you see it bleed over in dribs and drabs into other sports. Like you will see like the yes chant here or the Ric Flair thing in the locker room at the NFL. And you would think like, and we talk about it a lot that, you know, athletes don't, you know, people who love football or whatever don't watch wrestling because wrestling fans are nerds, they're dorks and stuff like that. And all of that might be true. But there's plenty of people who are fans of wrestling where being a wrestling fan is not their personality. They pick up on certain elements of wrestling because they do watch it in dribs and drabs. They do grow up with it, especially the blacks and Latinos, as I said before, but it's not their personality. Too often, we have wrestling fans where wrestling is their personality because it's born in obsession and a specific kind of love for the business. It does come across that you want to show everybody. It's like the cosplay thing. Like a lot of people grew up reading comic books, playing video games, but they aren't quote unquote gamers. Meaning they don't play every single game. They don't study who made the games. There's a hardcore element to everything. And some people are really at the surface level. And WWE is surface level pro wrestling. So you'll see very typically people who are fans of WWE stuff will triple into society, whether it be the theme songs of the NBA or something like that. And that's the extent of their fandom in terms of wrestling. But AEW appeals to the person who is usually ashamed of, or I shouldn't say that. I should rephrase that actually. That are shamed for being a wrestling fan. That you're a super fan, you watch Ring of Honor, you watch Impact, you watch this, you watch that, you should be ashamed of yourself. You know, the fat, neckbeard, loser, that demographic. Tony Khan is a great representation of that. Guy is not always the case, because Tony Khan's not a fat neckbeard loser. He's the son of a billionaire. You know, he probably has tons of friends who are wrestling fans who went with him to these shows, even if they weren't really super fans of ECW or whatever. They probably just went because he was going. He probably knows plenty of fans of certain demographics. You know, he's probably more likely to come across somebody who is a wrestling fan of a higher level income than he would of somebody who was lower level income. While somebody like me, you know, poor kid from the east side of Detroit, I didn't know any middle class people. Therefore, everybody who watched wrestling with me was in the same demographic as I was in. Young, black, male, poor as hell from the east side of Detroit. We're all super fans of wrestling. Some of them grew out of it. Some of them didn't. And that was the demographic that the market research guys and the academics who study wrestling, we fall into the demographic of fans that they expect. You know, supposedly lower educated, lower income, easily duped. You will easily believe that these guys are in a real fight, versus the higher income. There's no way this could possibly be real. These aren't blue collar people. Why would you watch this? That's the stuff that Tony Khan represents. He represents a demographic of people that academics and market researchers don't believe exists. And that is a wrestling fan with a high level of income and a high level of education. And she's saying, like, look, you know, in doing research, that she found a lot of these people, they do exist. And we know from Tony Khan's, I guess you could say, bragging, that he actually appeals to those people. You know, white males who have high levels of disposable income, which means they can afford $50 pay-per-views. And, you know, they are sort of anti-WWE because WWE is more for casuals, while AEW is more for guys like them. They're more likely to go to indie shows. They're more likely to buy wrestling merchandise that is like a t-shirt for a wrestler nobody's ever heard of. They're more likely to be involved with like Wrestling Observer newsletter, and they're more likely to be more quote unquote informed wrestling fans. And Tony Khan represents that group, and therefore there is an emotional attachment to him specifically. And through him, you can have this attachment to, you know, Samoa Joe and Claudio and Moxley. And so people do take it personally when you attack Tony Khan, or when you make fun of Tony Khan for his hugs and stuff like that. And they say, like, the guy's just a fan. It's like they're defending themselves because they feel like that's something they would do. If they have the opportunity to hire Samoa Joe or Claudio or somebody like that, they would probably hug them too, you know. Unlike Vince McMahon, who is seen as like sort of the evil businessman, even though Vince grew up poor and Tony Khan didn't. You know, it's a very different scenario because Vince has been playing a character for, you know, 30 or 40 years, in which shows that he's sort of, you know, this evil, don't give a shit about wrestlers, don't give a shit about wrestling kind of thing, when Vince was actually trying to protect the business. And so much that he actually had to deal with the same market forces that Bischoff had to deal with, in so much as you're trying to fight against stereotypes. So when Vince became, you know, created sports entertainment, it was his way of not only trying to escape the regulation, but also trying to escape all of the stereotypes that come with the word wrestling, that come with wrestling fans, that they're drunken losers who stab the performers and try to fight the performers in parking lots and stuff like this, which is the stuff that Jim Cornette loves about wrestling. You know, he loves when people were so passionate they were throwing chairs and lighting stuff on fire. But it's bad for business, because you have to pay for those damages, and there's insurance that comes with the big buildings and stuff like that, and people get sued, and so there is a lot of different things to look into here. And so I thought this was a very interesting conversation that I would come out here and talk to you guys about. But what do you think? What do you think about wrestling fans and the wrestling fandom? Is there something that you also want to discuss? I am interested in doing like a part 2, as I probably will look more into this. So thank you guys for your time, and I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.
Tell me what's worse than learning all that you led to believe was all horse crap. They just